Today, we are continuing on in our Advent sermon series, and actually in the process, we're going to be also starting a study in the book of Matthew. We'd originally intended to start this study after our Christmas series, but then it occurred to us that the first few chapters of this, as you might put together, cover Jesus' birth. So it'd be a little bit redundant to have Christmas time and cover Jesus' birth and then come right back and cover it a second time. So we'll be in Matthew chapter 1 today. If you're here and you happen to have brought your Bible with you or you want to look it up on your phone, you're welcome to go to Matthew chapter 1. We'll do the first part of the book, verses 1 through 17, and you can thumb through to that. And while you're turning there, and let me say, if you don't have a Bible, we'll have it all up on the screen so you can watch it there as well. While you guys are moving there, I thought I'd ask you a question. In the household you grow up in or with the parents that you have, what is one trait that you inherited from them? Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I'll tell you one of mine that my father has that I noticed just this last week was more prominent is that desire to go and find a good deal on things. And I was actually at Lowe's this last week, and Annabelle and I have been working, some of you might be aware, to remodel our first house. We just bought our first house, and so we've been switching out some appliances and that, and I'm short one hot water heater, so I'm going in there and looking to see if I can find it on the scratch and dent aisle at the store, because that's where I buy most of my stuff at. And you see washers and dryers and stoves and stuff like that pretty often, but water heaters are pretty rare. And so I went in there this last time, and I walked down the aisle, and no water heater. But when I got to the end of the aisle, I saw that they had a brand new Whirlpool washer and dryer. And normally it was $1,000, but it was on clearance. It had been a loaner to somebody for a week, and it was on clearance for $250 each. And so I thought, wow, that is cheap. Now the problem with this is I have a perfectly fine washer and dryer, and I actually don't need one. But I have to admit, my desire to get a good deal, I stood there and I was mesmerized for about 5 minutes, staring at those dumb washers and dryers, thinking, is there any reason that I would need this? Is there any use I could have? I even started calling friends and saying, hey, you need a washer and dryer? There's a cheap set here. And nobody needed it. So somebody, I'm sure, was blessed by a cheap washer and dryer. And boy, 25 cents on the dollar is definitely the way to do it. But my father would have definitely done that. In fact, my father probably would have carried those home and stored them out in the shop, but my wife apparently doesn't think that's the lifestyle we should live, and so so we will not be having our appliance emporium in our garage and hanging on to those. Anyway, do you guys have traits like that? Perhaps you have things, there's that old saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And maybe there's some ways in which you're vastly different than your parents. Of course, a hope for us and for our own children can be that we take from our parents the best that they had and leave behind the worst. And maybe, hopefully in your life, you found that in some ways to be true. I bring that up because today we're going to be looking at a passage that at a glance is probably going to look like the most boring section of Scripture that we could possibly read on a Sunday morning, and that is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And as we look at that, there's a few reasons it's there, and I think it's important for us to know. You might ask, why even have this in the book? Why did they include this? And I want to talk briefly before we dive into the passage about some of the why behind it. So one of the reasons, which as we've just demonstrated, exists today, but existed back then, is that oftentimes people would infer things about your identity based on who was in your past, who your ancestors were. If you, for example, had Daniel Boone as one of your ancestors, they might think you're a very adventurous, explorative person. But in this case, looking back at Jesus' descendancy, we can see some things about who the people were behind him. And people might even, you may have had people say in your life, well, your parents are really nice folks, so you must be, or something like that. Often we'll infer something like that. But another big reason that was important, especially to ancient Israel, to have a genealogy, is that in the ancient world, a genealogy was in some ways almost attuned to a social security number. It was something that was a key identifying thing. And if you wanted to tell somebody who you were, your ancestry would have been a big part of that. And that's for several reasons, and it's actually written, in a sense, into the legal code that governed the nation of Israel. Now, for example, when the Israelites came into the Promised Land and the land was broken apart, it was broken apart by tribe, and then within that, the different clans, and within that, the different families. And for each of us, if we were living in ancient Israel, then we would inherit from our parent some portion of the land that they had inherited when they came in the land. And that would forever be something that we were entitled to. The law was written so that nobody should ever take that land. You couldn't even sell it. You could lease it out for 40 years, and then it would come right back to you. but you permanently had possession of that land, and in that sense, you were identified with it. So if we knew what family you came from, or what clan, or what tribe you were in, we would have known where you lived even. We could have pieced that together. It's also important because when you went to pay taxes, that's how you identified yourself. Or when you went to give your tithe in the temple, they would ask you who you were, and part of it would be listing off some of that ancestry. Who were the people that you were connected with? That's how we would know who you were. And so another significant thing is when the Israelite military would gather together and all the men would be called out to come and defend the nation of Israel, they had sort of that Minuteman or militia paradigm of military defense throughout a better part of their history. You would have actually gathered up with your family. It would have been by tribe, clan, and family that everybody was together. For some of you, you might feel like you're going to war with your family on a regular basis anyway, so it'd be really familiar. For others, maybe not so much. But there was it was a central part of most things that you did in the nation. So from a legal standpoint, it would have been very important, not just that Jesus know this, but that you know this about yourself. It would have really spoken to who you were. And finally, the main reason that Jesus' genealogy is being listed here is because the author of this book, Matthew, who was a tax collector, who came to Christ, started following him, and for 3 years walked and was one of 12 people that was most close to Jesus Christ, watched what he taught, learned from him directly, and later on was involved in the growth of the church. Matthew, this eyewitness, is accounting this for why Jesus Christ is qualified to call himself the Messiah. Now, interesting to note, since Genesis chapter 3, since the very beginning of the creation of the world, God saw this issue that humanity has with sin, and he promised to us that someday he would send somebody forward to break that curse. There are over 350 prophecies present in the Old Testament that talk about the Messiah, and interestingly, Jesus Christ fulfills every single one of them. There is no literary version of this that exists outside of the Bible. And now there are many other prophecies in the Bible as well, I'll mention, that have all been 100% true as well. But just the Christs are very significant. So part of that, excuse me, a little bit of a dry throat. Part of this is that specific people were said to have been, that they would be in the line or in the lineage of the Christ when he finally came. And as we'll see when we start, one of those key people is David, the former king of Israel. It was prophesied that through David would eventually come someone who would be a Messiah, who would set his people free from their sins. And it was also said that through Abraham it would be, and so we'll start seeing some of these people listed off. And as we do it, we're not listing names just for the sake of listing names, but really Matthew, with his accounting skills, is showing us, these are the exact people who are ultimately in the line of Jesus. Excuse me for a moment. I'll mention one final thing about this passage as we read it. If you look really closely, you'll find some intriguing trends in it. And our passage today will break down into 3 different sections. And with each section, it's interesting to note that there are 14 different generations that are listed off. I'll also mention, just for your reference, that at verse 9, we'll actually see there's about 4 names in the genealogy that aren't listed. And I'll say that's not an uncommon thing in an ancient genealogy. Often it was known, that, for example, that Jacob was a descendant of Abraham, so you don't necessarily have to mention Isaac in between. And in fact, Jewish culture held that if you were the grandparent of somebody, that in a sense they were your kid. And so there would have been that common language, and they might have said that you were the parent of your grandchild, even though we've skipped a few generations, or of your great-grandchild. So these trends are there as it's written out. But it's interesting to note that in Jewish culture, often children would have learned to count by looking at the numeric value of the letters in the Jewish language. And each letter had a numeric value ascribed to it. And when you take the numeric value of David's name, then it actually adds up to 14. And so here we have 3 different sections that have 14 generations each. This is also, so this seems to point back to David, but it also is handy because in the ancient world, most people would not have had a copy of the Bible to carry around with them. In fact, even just to have a sheet of paper that you wrote down a passage on would have been quite expensive, and a large number of people wouldn't have even known how to write it. So the common way that you would handle that is by memorizing things. So if you were an early Christian and you wanted to know what Jesus' genealogy was, you might very well have sat down with somebody who had a copy of this, and you'd have known, okay, 3 sets of 14 generations. I got to remember each one, and then I'll know it, and I could actually have it for later. And it was a common practice in the ancient world to memorize, whole books of the Bible or whole sections of it, which is pretty impressive. It's a discipline that we've let fall today, although it's a really wonderful way to become more intimate with God's word. When you memorize it, there's a sense in which you feel like you own it, and you can really apply it in a better way. So all of these things are key aspects to the genealogy of Jesus. And as we read through this today, as we usually do, we'll read a section at a time. We'll stop and we'll discuss it. And I just want to zero in on a couple of the names. You're going to see, as you've gathered, more than 14 names in each section. And each one has a story to it. And it's sort of interesting because there's several trends to it. And there's also some big takeaways that I think we can take from the names that we see in the genealogy of Jesus. Not only does this affirm who he is as the Messiah, but it talks in a big way about how God works. And in the process, it gives us a good reason for finding joy, which is our week of Advent that we're on, for finding joy in God through who Jesus Christ is. So we'll begin by reading verses 1 through 6 today. Before we do, I'll ask you one more time just to join me for a moment of prayer and try to prepare our hearts. Lord, I would wager most of the people who have been in the faith long have read through parts of Matthew and maybe even read through this section. I know I have, and it's easy to skip over what we're about to read. Lord, I pray that you would bring it to life for us. You would help us to see why you have this in your word and to be able to draw important lessons from it. Lord, thank you that we have this opportunity as a community to gather together, to hear from you, and to be changed by your word. And pray that you would be at work in our hearts this Christmas season, drawing us closer to you. That would be the greatest gift of all. We pray these things in your Son, Jesus Christ's name. Amen. All right. Here we go. So Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Solomon, Solomon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. So before I go back and we discuss some of these verses, I want to point out, just for some interesting history here, when you look in verse 3, halfway through it, at the name Perez, if you carry down from there to Amminadab, those lifespans actually fill a total of 450 years. So a few names can often be, especially with longer lifespans closer to creation, can actually be a long period of time. Just in another point of reference, from the end of verse 4 there, Nahshon down to David, that was another 400 years of time that took place. So big periods of time going by as we list these names. Now let's go back to verse 1. I want to point out Matthew begins by incorporating David into this, first and foremost, which is sort of interesting because typically in a genealogy, you'd put the emphasis on the first name you mention. In this case, chronologically, the first name would be Abraham, and yet Matthew is zeroing in on David himself. And the reason for this is because we know David is one of the most recent people who's promised to be in the lineage of the Messiah. So it's really important that we see that. He's also one of the most prominent people. The Messiah was going to be a king like David, in the best senses of who David was. And so we're seeing a push towards that. I also want to point out that just this word genealogy used here is actually the Greek word Genesis, where we get our word Genesis from. It means, the origin or the beginning or the genealogy. It can have all three meanings. So we're not just talking about a formal genealogy being written here, but how Jesus came about. This is the story of how he came to exist and the people who were involved in that story. In the middle part of verse 1, it points out that Jesus is the Messiah. And that word, we might hear sometimes, the Greek word for it would be Messiah. The the Hebrew word for it would be Messiah. The Greek word would be the Christ, or the anointed one. Both words have the same meaning. Somebody who's been set apart by God for a very holy purpose. And this language looks backward towards the Old Testament and was often used to describe the Messiah when he would come. So to a Jewish reader hearing this, they wouldn't hear the anointed person who is a special guy, but who was the chosen person from God sent to actually redeem his people, to set them free. It's a big role. Now, I just want to zero in each of these sections on a few different names and talk about them and just point out some of the different traits that are here. And the first one I'll point out is Abraham, the first name that we hear. Abraham, of course, was the person who God came to and started his covenant with, the person who he began all of that with. And it's interesting because in Abraham's life, was Abraham always a great guy? Not always. Abraham made some imperfect decisions. And one of the most famous of those was that later in Abraham's life, though he'd been promised that eventually his wife Sarah would give birth to a son, Abraham and Sarah both lost hope in that. And they decided, you know what, maybe God's not going to do what he says. Maybe we can't trust him. We're in our 90s. Is this actually going to happen? Probably not. And so they made the decision together that at Sarah's recommendation that Abraham should become intimate with his handmaiden Hagar and then have a son through him or through her. The ultimate effect of that was that a nation came from that, which had enmity with the Jewish people throughout their lives. So I want to point out, even Abraham, this first person listed, was not a perfect human being. He made some mistakes in the course of his life, and there are others we find recorded. Another interesting thing to note, and some of the names that we'll next focus in on, are that typically in a genealogy, you wouldn't list the name of women. Now, the point here wasn't that they wanted to be intentionally sexist. The idea was typically heredity was tracked through the male side. You had to kind of choose one side or the other, or else you'd have a really jumbled tree in that sense, at least in terms of where you're placed in society. And that meant many things. So, for example, if you were a woman in the ancient Hebrew world, and your family lived on one side of the nation, and you ended up marrying a guy who lived on the other side of the nation, well, then you wouldn't inherit land from your family, but you would go and your inheritance would then be connected with his. You would be connected with his tribe, and from a legal stance, you would then be viewed as part of their family or part of their group, which helped categorize who you were. The names of the women listed here, though, are quite interesting because of their history. And the first one I want to talk about is in verse 3, it mentions that Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, Tamar has an interesting history we don't often talk about, and I want to take just a moment right now to discuss it. Tamar was married to, in an arranged marriage, Judah's oldest son. Now, as a reminder, Judah is the founder of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So he's a very significant figure in the history of Israel. And you might even recognize him from the story of Joseph. One of the things he's famous for is when Joseph was thrown in a pit and his brothers were saying they should kill him. Judah was the one who came up with the clever idea of, instead of just murdering him, why don't we sell him as a slave instead? And if you think your family has some drama, I guess there's some competition here. And Judah was involved in that. Well, Judah has sort of a mixed history, and his oldest son ended up marrying Tamar. And we don't hear a lot about the oldest son, other than we're told in Genesis chapter 38 that Tamar's first husband was such a terrible guy that God killed him. If you're such a bad guy that God kills you, and he even records it in the Bible, that's probably not a good sign, right, in terms of what kind of life you're living. So after that happened, Tamar had not borne any children through the oldest son, and according to Jewish tradition, the lineage or the line of that older son needed to be maintained. And so what typically would have happened is that Tamar would have then been married off to the next oldest son, and that's in fact what Judah did. Judah arranged to have her married to the next son in line, and that son became intimate with her, but he went out of his way to make sure that she wouldn't be pregnant. And in that sense, robbed her of actually producing the heir that she was supposed to produce for the oldest son. We read in Genesis 38, God's response to that was that he was furious. This person denied her that right, and God actually struck him down too. So now, Judah has these two sons who have some serious moral issues. Both of them are dead, and Judah looks at Tamar and thinks, maybe you're some kind of black widow or something. I don't know what's going on here. My sons are dying, and so I don't really feel safe about this. And Judah, in that moment, promises Tamar, when my youngest son, my last son, when he gets old enough that he can be married because he was underage, then I'll marry him off to you. Tamar waits. And waiting would have meant wearing black mourning cloth every day because of her two husbands' death. So for years she was in this state. Finally, this son grows into adulthood. She's waiting for the marriage to happen, and Judah doesn't keep his word. He lies to her. And now she is stuck in this weird limbo. Now, it's good to note as well that in the ancient world, she was stuck in a pretty precarious position. She can't just walk away and go marry somebody else. That wouldn't have been allowed. But she also isn't being allowed to marry the person that she's supposed to marry. And good also to say, this is the era before 401ks existed or nursing homes. So having kids was handy in several ways. The expendable labor force is nice. But also, when you got all that farm work, but also someday, and some of you have said these words probably, someday we're going to get old and want to retire, and hopefully these kids will take care of us. Well, that would have been an important thing because culturally that was the expectation. Your children were responsible to take care of you, although if your children were not good people, they might just abandon you on the street. In Tamar's case, she has no heir. No one's going to take care of her. There is no state infrastructure in place to assist her. And so, in an act of desperation, Tamar actually starts listening in to what's going on with Judah. And soon she hears that Judah is going to be heading down with a bunch of his men to a nearby community. And while he's down there, they're going to shear all of their sheep. And that would have been a big yearly festival. You would have invited a whole bunch of people to help you out because there's a lot of manual labor involved in hand shearing all the sheep. But also, there would be a big party afterwards because the value of that wool was quite substantial. So you could actually take that and have a big payday off of it. She hears that Judah's headed down there, and she leaves the house, sneaks off, goes down to that community, and at a pagan temple just inside the doorway, she wears a veil and acts like a prostitute, looks like a prostitute, sits there, and to Judah's discredit, the first thing he does when he enters this community is sees the pretty girl standing over there who appears to be a prostitute, walks up to her and says, "How much?" They begin having a conversation. She says, "Well, how are you going to pay me?" He says, "I'll give you a goat." She says, "Well, you don't have a goat here, so how do I know you're going to keep your word?" And so Judah says, "All right, I'll take my signet ring, the ring that has the seal of our family on it. I'll hand you that. I'll take my staff that's custom to me, and I'll hand you that. And then after we're done with our business here, I'll go off and I'll have my servant come back and bring you a goat, and you can have that as payment." They go ahead with the deed. Afterwards, Tamar skips town. Now, it's sort of interesting what happens with Judah. I think it's a little bit comedic. Judah sends his servant back. His servant comes back, looks for her, can't find her, and so he starts asking locals, "Hey, where's the prostitute that works at that temple?" Which would have been a common thing in the ancient world, in pagan temples. And the locals say, "There is no prostitute that works at that temple." And suddenly, Judah starts to realize he's been taken. He has no idea who this woman is, and he has the option to tell the community, "Guys, I went and slept with this prostitute, and she tricked me and stole my stuff," but is that going to reflect well on him? No, obviously not. And so out of embarrassment, Judah does not tell anybody about it. He goes home. 3 months later, his servants come to him and say, "Judah, your firstborn son's wife, Tamar, has done something scandalous. She's pregnant." Now, without missing a beat, Judah's response is, "Burn her to death. Kill her." Not super graceful, is he? If you thought your father-in-law was bad, apparently you could do worse. But that's the response. Tamar, though, when hearing this, the servants come to her to come get her, and she sends a message back to Judah. She sends his ring and his staff, and she asks the messenger, "Tell Judah that the father of the child is the owner of these items." And Judah suddenly has an epiphany. Now, what's interesting is Judah, in response, says, "You know what? I actually had that coming. It's bad on me. I promised she'd be able to marry my son. I didn't actually allow it. And so I deserved it." Now, that said, in the ancient world, it was absolutely forbidden in the Levitical law for you to have sex with your mother or father-in-law. And so this is quite a scandalous thing. In fact, it would have been a capital crime in and of itself. And yet, Tamar, in this position of desperation, stepped out, made this decision, and as a result, now, of all things, she's in the lineage of Jesus. Does this seem like somebody who belongs there? Well, maybe not at face value, but as we'll see in a moment, there's more interesting characters. That's one of the longer stories, but we'll touch on a few more of these that we saw. In verse 5, you'll see a woman by the name of Rahab, who is mentioned. And Rahab is famous because when the Israelites entered the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, one of the first things they were sent to do was to take over the city of Jericho, which had immense walls surrounding it. It was strategically one of the most hard to defeat cities in the whole area. And initially, spies were sent to go into the city and collect data on how many troops do they have, how big and how strong are they. And that news wasn't terribly good news, but in the process, the spies were nearly caught, and Rahab actually hid them. And in the discussion with them, Rahab revealed to them, I'm here, I work as a prostitute in one of the temples, I have this broken background, but I have to tell you, we're all terrified of you, and if I have a choice, I want to go and follow Yahweh. Count me on your team. So Rahab actually confesses a faith in Yahweh, not fully understanding who he is, but knowing enough to say, whoever that God is, that's the one I want to have as my own. And ultimately, God saves that one part of the wall of Jericho from collapsing. She's rescued, and she ends up marrying a Israelite man. And again, a prostitute. Who would have thought? And yet, here is this seemingly uncouth character, and yet somebody who took a step of faith, and here she is in the lineage of Jesus. Next, we can see Ruth is the next woman who's listed here. And Ruth is interesting too, because Ruth is actually, like Rahab, a foreigner. In Jewish culture, you typically would have married somebody within Judaism, and that's not because of racial reasons so much as because of religious reasons. If you were from another area, you probably followed pagan gods, and God didn't want the Israelites wandering off and worshiping those same people, which Judah seems to give us some note as to why that might be a bad thing. But Ruth is in this tough position. She marries this Jewish man, and he dies. And she, in faithfulness, agrees to go home with Naomi, her mother-in-law, back to Israel. She, rightly, should have been taken in by one of the family members. There were no more sons left for her to be married off to. In that case, one of the nearest male family members should have taken her and used her, taken her as a wife and used her to produce offspring to carry on that name. But none of them quickly stepped up to do it. And in what is often looked at as a fairly scandalous thing, Ruth steps in, seduces a guy and ends up married off to him in the long run. It works out. She's in a desperate position, and she's largely doing it because her mother-in-law asks her to. And yet, from the outsider looking at this, it would have seemed pretty scandalous what Ruth did. And here she is, yet again, in the lineage of Jesus. Now, we'll go ahead and continue on from there. We get down to David himself in verse 6. And as we read the second part of verse 6, kind of where we left off, we'll start at David, and we'll continue from him to the point where the Israelites are going to be exiled in Babylon. So chronologically, these names are all ordered. On top of there being 14 generations in each, there's also a chronology that fits to it. So second part of verse 6. It says, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asa. Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram. Jehoram, the father of Uzziah. Uzziah, the father of Jotham. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh, the father of Ammon. Ammon, the father of Josiah. And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. Okay, now the next, this is the final woman we see mentioned until the very end, but the next person I want to talk about, because it's very interesting where typically women's names wouldn't be here, it's interesting that they're included. There must be something to that. In that first verse we read, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. Now, here we see that actually, notice it doesn't say that David's wife was Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, but it actually, and it doesn't describe her as David's wife, it describes her as Uriah's wife, and there's a reason to that. There was another scandalous story that happened here. King David, who for most of his life was a very exemplary king, made some really disastrous decisions at some points in his life. And one of those was in the later part of his reign, when he should have been off fighting at war when other nations were invading him. Instead of going and leading his men from the front lines as traditionally a king would do, instead, David stayed back behind, stayed at his palace, and relaxed there while the other men were fighting. And while he was there, he walked out on his deck one morning, looked down, and on the roof of a nearby house was his close friend Uriah's wife, who was bathing. And in that moment, David burned heavily with lust for this woman. It's interesting to note, Uriah is actually one of David's 30 mighty men. So he's part of a very elite group of men that had served David faithfully for years and had been there in some of the toughest conflict. He was actually one of the most elite soldiers in the Israelite army. But in spite of this friendship that David has, and the fact that David, being king and all, could basically marry any unwed woman he wanted to in the kingdom, David decided, I want that one. Bathsheba came up, and it's unclear precisely how complicit she was in things, but it's typically held that she went along with it at the least. Bathsheba ends up having an intimate relationship with David, and that results in her becoming pregnant, which puts David in a panic. Now David's got his best friend's wife pregnant by him. Uriah wasn't even around, so we know Uriah can't be the one who made things happen. And so David sends an emergency dispatch out to the front lines and says, get Uriah and give him a report of what's going on in the battle and send him back to me. And once Uriah gets there, David is hobnobbing with him, trying to be friendly, gets him drunk, and then tells him, why don't you go home and spend some time with your wife? Now, it's obvious what David's intent is. He wants to cover it up. If Uriah sleeps with his wife, then David can say, well, my kid, it was his. And Uriah will have no reason to suspect otherwise. But Uriah, having been gone for months, is probably going to figure out that he wasn't the father at some point here. Now, Uriah, to his credit, says, you know what, while my brothers are out there dying on the front lines, I'm not going to go home and spend time with my wife. It was actually also instructed in the law of Israel that soldiers, when they were at war, shouldn't be intimate with their wives, that they should be focused on the battle. I think it made them meaner, being without for a while. But anyway, but Uriah doesn't sleep with his wife, and so David now knows the gig's up. Someone's going to find out. Now, he could have owned it at that point and said, Uriah, I'm the worst friend you've ever had. I have to tell you what's happened. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he sends him back to the battlefield, and he instructs everybody, instructs his general, you need to find the nastiest, gnarliest spot in the next battle and put Uriah right in the middle of it. While you're at it, you can have everybody take a step back and just make sure that he gets killed. Uriah is killed in that way. In the process, he's murdered. Bathsheba, of course, mourns the loss of her husband, ultimately comes and is married to David. And yet, despite all of this brokenness and really the scandal surrounding this, again, Bathsheba is in the lineage of Jesus. I'll also mention it's traditionally held that Bathsheba was likely also not of Jewish birth because she was married to a Hittite. So typically, Uriah, being from a foreign country, probably would have taken a wife from a similar country. Bathsheba isn't a terribly Jewish name either, although we now associate it with it. But it's interesting to note that, yet again, there was a Gentile in the lineage. So Jesus is not, from a genetic standpoint, or at least as we read through this heredity, is not a purebred Jewish person, which you might think, if it was going to be a king or the Messiah, that would be the case. But that expectation is being defied. I also want to make mention of, in the section we read about Rehoboam. Rehoboam is Solomon's son, and Rehoboam is given the opportunity when he becomes king to either listen to some of Solomon's wise advisors or to listen to some of his friends. And the nation is really at a crossroads. Solomon, during his reign, has expanded the size of the federal government several hundred times over. And as a result, the taxes that are being collected from the people have grown and grown and grown. And Solomon's advisors tell Rehoboam, when his father dies and he takes over, you need to cut taxes. Your people are stretched so thin, they are so angry, you're going to be in trouble if you don't. But Rehoboam's friends say to him, that's dumb. That's not what you should do. You ought to man up and go in there and you just tell him, if you think it was bad before, watch how bad I can make it now. And unfortunately, Rehoboam follows his friend's direction. As a result, the nation of Israel, for the first time, is split in half. Now there's the northern and southern kingdom, completely different kings for them, different religious systems for them. Ultimately, the northern kingdom goes way astray in terms of their following of Yahweh. And although there's some decent human beings who are there, they never really have a decent king who loves God and follows him throughout the rest of their existence. That all started with Rehoboam and with his decision. On the plus side, in verse 9, we read about Hezekiah, and Hezekiah was the opposite. He actually was a reforming king. Every king on every side of him was a terrible person, but Hezekiah discovered, hidden away, a copy of God's word and asked, hey, what is this? That's how distant the nation had come from it. And he ordered the people to get back to the discipline of following God again. And as a result, God delayed Babylon coming and conquering them for several decades. So here was an actual decent leader. Also interesting to note, though, he's there. Finally, verse 11, we read about Jeconiah. Jeconiah is perhaps the worst history in the entire history of the kingdom of Israel. Jeconiah's conduct was utterly scandalous. He was a king who was known to, if he saw that a man was married to a woman and she was pretty, he would often have that man murdered in order to take the wife as his own. He would go and kill people in order to take their land if he wanted it. If you had an especially good crop that year, then he'd send in one of his teams to go get rid of you, and he'd say, oh, the king needs that now. So just an utter tyrant. Spiritually, he led the nation down the worst roads possible, worshiping constantly pagan gods. And when you read books like Ezekiel, you see that the moral decay that happened in the nation of Israel was probably as bad as it could ever be. It was at an all-time low. Jeconiah was a leader involved in that. Now, because of how terrible a king Jeconiah was, interestingly, God actually said to Jeconiah that he would not be, none of his children would be in the lineage of the Messiah. Well, that might sound a little strange, because if you guys have been reading with me here, you might have noticed this is the genealogy of Jesus. And so that doesn't seem to fit. And at the same time, we know that whoever the Messiah is, he has to be a rightful heir to the throne of David. And if Jeconiah was the final king in that dynasty, then it seems like he should be a descendant of him. Now, this is sort of interesting because God accomplishes this. And he does it because here we're reading the genealogy of Joseph. And of course, Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus. God is. And so, but Joseph is the husband of Mary. He marries Mary. And as a result, Jesus becomes his firstborn child. And by Jewish law, if you adopt a child and he's the oldest, then he becomes your oldest son. In every sense, he becomes your oldest son. And so God actually keeps his word that it won't be a descendant of Jeconiah who actually brings about the Messiah, but yet the Messiah will be in the lineage of that king. On the other hand, if we read the book of Luke, we'll see Mary's genealogy, and we'll find out that it was a different child of Solomon through whom Mary's genealogy comes. She's still a descendant of David, and she's many generations disconnected, so it's not like they're first cousins or something like that. But biologically, she has no descendancy that connects back to Jeconiah. All right, let's read the final section. We'll go through it a little faster, verses 12 through 17. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, the father of Abihud. Abihud, the father of Eliakim. Eliakim, the father of Azor. Azor, the father of Zadok. Zadok, the father of Akim. Akim, the father of Elihud. Elihud, the father of Eleazar. Eleazar, the father of Matan. Matan, the father of Jacob. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. All right. Now, just some interesting things to know. We could say a lot about a lot of these different people, and we've condensed it a lot, but I'm just trying to hit some of the high points. When you guys see in verse 12, Zerubbabel. Interesting to know, Zerubbabel was actually the person responsible for leading the first group of Israelites who were released from Babylonian captivity under Cyrus, the king of Persia. who were released from them to go home. So he led the first group of Israelites to come back and to resettle Jerusalem and to rebuild it. And of course, by the days of Jesus, that's 400 years later, it will be rebuilt. There'll be a temple there. All those things will be accomplished. Intriguingly, one of Jesus' very descendants was involved in starting that process. I also want to point out at the end of this, I'll mention that because these men weren't kings, the kingly line dies off, in David's line, dies off with Jeconiah and then restarts with Jesus, that we don't know a lot about the people in between. We see them mentioned, perhaps there is some other info, but it's pretty condensed because they lived fairly normal lives once they weren't royalty. But we do see Joseph in verse 16, and I want to point out how Joseph is described here. Notice it says, Joseph, the husband of Mary. Now, in every other section that we've read about a generational shift, it says in the Old English, this person begat that person, or in the case of the modern English, as we're reading it in the NIV here, this person was the father of that person. But notice with Joseph, it doesn't say he was the father of Jesus. It says he was the husband of Mary. This again is pointing to and affirming the idea of the virgin birth. Joseph wasn't the one who went and conceived this child. It was actually God along with Mary. And then again, we see Mary mentioned here. And an intriguing thing with this, now this is the fifth woman that we found mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. And something I find intriguing about this is when Mary had Jesus, or even when she was pregnant with him, it must have been the talk of the town. Because here is this woman who is promised to be married to Joseph, and an engagement in the ancient world was legally binding. You had to go through many steps. It's sort of the equivalent of a divorce to even end it. You weren't physically intimate with the person yet until you were actually married, but still there was a binding contract that was involved in engagement. Now for Mary, she's gotten engaged here, and yet somewhere along the line she's gotten pregnant. And as you might recall, Joseph's first response is, although he could have said, hey, let's get this girl stoned to death, which would have been the punishment for breaking an engagement like that, instead he decides, I'm just going to quietly sneak off and leave her be. She made some mistake. I don't know what it is. I'm sure Joseph felt convinced. He knows he didn't have sex with her, but somebody must have because she's pregnant now. And he gets ready to leave, but God gives him a vision and explains to him, actually, the child in Mary is from me. You need to be the father to it. I've chosen you to play that role. Now Joseph's on board, but do you think anyone else in the community is going to believe that? Probably not. Sounds like a convenient excuse for Mary. And so for Mary's part, she has to be publicly shamed in the community. Probably the most favorable thing that could have happened to her from the society's perspective is if somebody had raped her, which obviously would be terrible, but at least she would have had less fault in it. Most people probably would have assumed that Mary had actually gone out and found some other guy and been intimate with them, or perhaps a slightly better, maybe she slipped up and had that relationship with Joseph, but the fact that Joseph was ready to ditch her seemed to indicate that's probably not the case. He would have just sort of hurried the engagement and gone right along with it to marriage if he'd actually been responsible for it. And it's strange because Mary's done nothing wrong here. She's actually been obedient to God. God chooses her out of all women to play this key role and to bring the Messiah through. And I can't help but think when we look back at Tamar and at Rahab and at Ruth and at Bathsheba and these other women, you know, in their own lifetime, they dealt with so many of these same social stigmas. And I can't help but think they would look at her and say, girl, we know what that's like. We know what it's like to be there. And in Mary's descendancy, they must have, there's this weird amount of relationship, and we can see the author pulling this out. Now, beyond all of that, of course, Matthew's showing us Jesus is qualified to be the Messiah. Because of the family and the people that he's come through, he's fulfilling many different ancient prophecies, and he's showing himself to be just that, the Christ. And of course, continuing onward in the book, in the Gospel of Matthew, we'll see even more evidence and a much stronger case made for that. The question might be, though, what do we do with that? And one of the things I want to point out with this is, when we look at the history of just a handful of people in Jesus' lineage, we can see there's a lot of brokenness there, right? I mean, probably more drama than most of us have had in our families, probably more than any family you've ever known even, that have gone on in these different ancestors of Jesus. And yet, God took these imperfect people where they were at, and not only did he sustain them through their lives, but ultimately, he used them as part of the genealogy of the Messiah. They became a part of his story. Who would have thought that Rahab, a foreign prostitute, here in sort of the lowest caste that she could be in society, would then go and be married to an honorable Jewish man and actually be in Jesus' lineage. And I point this out to say, I think for many of us, as we look at Christmas season, we can look back at our own history. We can see areas of brokenness in our lives. We can see things that we regret that we've done. Maybe they were before you knew Jesus. Maybe they were momentary, foolish decisions you made while you knew Jesus. Whatever the case, we can often look back and think, with how broken I am, I don't know how God can use me. I don't know what use I will be to him. Well, the genealogy of Jesus tells us a story. And that story is that God's really good at taking broken things and giving them a bigger purpose. And most of these people may not have even known that someday they would be connected to Jesus. In their own lives, I'm sure that as they turned to him, they saw his grace. But for us today, we can stand here and we can take joy from the fact that no matter how broken our past is, no matter how big our mess-ups are, that if we turn to God, God in his sovereignty can take the brokenness of our life and he can make something better out of it. And if God is faithful to fulfill his promise to bring about the Messiah in the way he did, then God's promise that he'll take care of you and that he'll not let you be tested in temptation beyond what you can handle, that he'll sustain you until you can come home to heaven. That promise is there, and that promise is equally true. His sovereignty over Jesus' lineage and his sovereignty over you are no different. And that's a reason for joy. Whatever brokenness you have, there's grace for it. So we'll go ahead and take a moment right now, and we'll light our Advent candles here. And we'll see. Actually, I think our candles are getting a little bit low, so they may be a little dim today. But all right. And as we do that, I'll go ahead and invite one of our leaders to come forward for our time of communion and offering, and Megan's going to share some music with us, so she can come forward too. As they do, I'll ask you to join me for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can see clearly through the life and through the lives that led up to Jesus how big your grace is. Lord, thank you that even if we have scars in our life or areas of brokenness where we were put in bad positions and didn't choose wisely, or where our sin marred us, thank you that your Son offers us grace that can cover that up. This Christmas season, Father, I pray that you'd help us to take hold of that and to not dwell on the areas of our past brokenness, but instead to grasp hold of the hope that we can find in you. Thank you, Lord, the reason for joy that you give us, your abundant grace. We love you and we pray these things in Jesus Christ's name and merit. Amen.